For centuries, we've been trained to look for power in the obvious places. Crowns, thrones, armies, flags planted on conquered land, but some of the most powerful forces in history never ruled territory at all. No king, no capital, no standing army, no single ruler issuing commands. And yet, this force shaped prices, controlled access to markets, punished kings, and decided which cities prospered and which quietly collapsed. Its reach stretched from London to Novgorod, from the North Sea deep into the Baltic. It wasn't an empire. It was a network of merchants who understood something most rulers didn't yet grasp. If you control trade, you don't need to control land. Power will come to you anyway. Welcome to Financial Timeline, where money, power, and history collide. And nothing is ever as simple as it looks. To understand how the Hanseatic League emerged, you have to abandon the romantic image of medieval Europe. This wasn't a world of stable kingdoms and predictable markets. It was fragmented, violent, unreliable. After the collapse of Roman authority, Northern Europe splintered into weak states, feuding princes, city lords, and overlapping feudal claims. Borders shifted constantly. Laws changed the moment you crossed a river. Justice depended on who controlled the road beneath your feet. For merchants, this wasn't just inconvenient. It was lethal. Trade existed, but protection didn't. Ships faced piracy in the North Sea and the Baltic. Caravans were taxed, robbed, or confiscated outright. A merchant could load a ship with grain or timber and lose everything before reaching the next port, not because demand exist, but because security didn't. Kings were happy to tax trade when it passed through their lands. They were far less interested in protecting it once it left their borders. Contracts meant little across jurisdictions. If a deal collapsed in a foreign city, there was often no court willing or able to enforce it. And yet, the profits were too large to ignore. Northern Europe was rich in exactly what the rest of the continent needed: timber, grain, salt, fish, wool, amber, furs. Cities were growing. Demand was rising. Trade routes were forming, whether rulers liked it or not. The problem wasn't demand. The problem was trust. Trust between strangers, trust across languages, laws, and loyalties. And trust in this world was scarce. So merchants faced a choice: accept permanent vulnerability, or build their own system of protection. The origins of the Hanseatic League weren't political or ideological. They were practical. In the 12th century, merchants from cities like Lübeck and Hamburg began cooperating informally. They shared ships, traveled in convoys, exchanged information about dangerous ports, corrupt officials, and hostile rulers. What began as mutual aid quickly became strategy. Cooperation reduced risk. Lower risk reduced costs. Lowered costs increased profits, and once merchants realized collaboration paid better than competition, the logic became impossible to ignore. Over time, these relationships hardened. Cities that welcomed and protected merchants gained access to goods, capital, and connections. Cities that didn't were quietly bypassed. Trade routes stopped reflecting geography and started reflecting trust. Lübeck emerged as a critical hub linking the Baltic to inland Europe. Hamburg connected river trade to the North Sea. These cities weren't powerful because they had armies. They were powerful because they were unavoidable. And here's the key point: no one designed the Hanseatic League. There was no founding charter, no declaration, no moment of creation. It emerged the way markets often do, organically, driven by incentives. Alignment turned into expectation. Expectation turned into rules. Rules turned into leverage. As the network expanded, something subtle but dangerous happened. Trade stopped being just an economic activity. It became an enforcement mechanism. If enough merchants refused to trade with a city, that city suffered. Supplies dried up, prices peaked, revenue collapsed. Cooperation wasn't enforced with violence, it was enforced through exclusion. And in a world dependent on trade, exclusion was devastating. This was the quiet genius of the Hanseatic system. It didn't overthrow states. It worked around them. Kings controlled land. Merchants controlled access. And access to grain, timber, salt, and credit mattered more than banners on castles. By the 13th century, these merchant networks spanned dozens of cities, different languages, different rulers, but when it came to trade, they increasingly acted as one, not because they were ordered to, but because the system rewarded compliance and punished defiance. This was a new kind of power, not rooted in divine authority, not enforced by conquest, but built on logistics, trust, and collective enforcement. As coordination deepened, the League institutionalized its presence. In major foreign cities, Hanseatic merchants established contes, semi-autonomous trading enclaves operating under their own rules. London's Steelyard, Bruges, Antwerp, Novgorod. These weren't embassies, but they functioned like them. They housed merchants, stored goods, resolved disputes internally, and negotiated collectively with local authorities. And that distinction mattered, because once negotiations were collective, leverage shifted. A single merchant could be coerced. A network controlling essential trade flows could not. If a ruler violated agreements, the response was impersonal and brutal. Trade stopped. Ships rerouted. Goods disappeared. Economic warfare without armies. Violence was expensive. Denial was efficient. Discipline wasn't enforced by ideology. It was enforced by profit. Break the rules, lose access. Over time, rulers learned the lesson the hard way. Sovereignty meant very little if markets turned against you. The Hanseatic League wasn't universally admired. Local merchants resented it. Rulers distrusted it. Excluded cities accused it of monopoly correctly. The League fixed prices, restricted access, coordinated supply. By any modern definition, it behaved like a cartel. The difference: there was no authority strong enough to regulate it. And here's the uncomfortable truth. The League didn't become powerful because it was corrupt. It became powerful because it solved a problem no one else could. In a world without reliable states, it provided reliability. Without enforceable law, it enforced norms. Without security guarantees, it reduced risk. People didn't participate because they were forced. They participated because the alternative was worse. By the 14th century, the League acted openly as a political force. When Danish kings threatened its interests, the League didn't appeal to higher authority. It raised fleets, blockaded ports, negotiated treaties as an equal. King Valdemar IV of Denmark didn't defeat the League. He conceded to it. Nothing says limited power like forcing a king to renegotiate. And yet, even at its peak, the Hanseatic League never became a state. No capital, no permanent treasury, no unified military command. On paper, it looked fragile. In reality, it endured for centuries, because its strength didn't come from centralization. It came from alignment. Protect the system, and the system protects you. Eventually, the balance shifted. States centralized power. Navies expanded. Atlantic trade eclipsed the Baltic. The governments the League once outperformed began catching up. The Hanseatic League didn't collapse. It faded quietly as incentives changed, but the lesson it leaves behind is sharper than ever. You don't need sovereignty to wield power. You don't need armies if you control access, and you don't need ideology when incentives do the work for you. The Hanseatic League didn't rule Northern Europe by decree. It ruled by necessity, and that is often the most durable form of control there is. If this changed how you think about power, subscribe. History has the answers. Financial Timeline shows you where to look.